several types of conformity. Internalization is changing your beliefs or your behavior to fit a wider social group, because you've internalized those beliefs or those behavioral norms and think genuinely that they are your own. Compliance is aligning your behavior to fit the wider social group, despite your own private doubts, out of a desire to fit in or out of a fear of being rejected out of that social group. And thirdly, identification is changing your behavior to fit a set of social norms. These are usually associated with a specific role or a specific position within society. There are also two main explanations for this conformity. ISI, or informational social influence, is conforming and changing your behavior based on information gained from or about the wider social group. NSI, or normative social influence, is conforming or changing your behavior based on apparent and obvious social norms and expected behavior from the wider social group. The research done by Sherif in 1935 looks into conformity and informational social influence. This was a laboratory experiment using a repeated measures design, where the same thing is done over and over again. Participants in this experiment were told that a single spot of light in an otherwise completely dark room would move. In fact, this was an optical illusion called the autokinetic effect. The light appeared to move, but actually remained completely stationary. Participants were asked to estimate how far they thought this spot of light had moved. They were first tested individually, then in groups, and then individually again. When they were tested individually, participants arrived at their own answers, called personal norms. But when they were tested as a group, the participants converged towards a mean. They all conformed. And then, when they were tested individually again for a third and final time, the participants generally stuck to these group norms that had developed. Participants had therefore been influenced by the information that they'd gained from others around them. Informational social influence had therefore been present. They'd taken the information and used it to form their own views. This study was done under controlled laboratory conditions, and therefore there was good control of the variables. It was possible to establish a cause and effect relationship. But this was an artificial situation. There was little relevance to the real world. It therefore had limited ecological validity. It was not really valid in a real-world setting. There was also an obvious ethical issue. Participants were deceived right from the very start of the experiment. Asch, in 1951, looked into NSI, normative social influence. This was a laboratory experiment again, but using a different design, independent groups. Participants were asked to state which of three lines matched a standard line. They were placed in groups of 8, but they were not told that the other 7 people in the group were actually Confederates. Confederates are people who pretend to be participants, but are actually working for the researcher. All of the actual real participants gave their answer either last or next to last. The Confederates, who mostly went before them, gave deliberately wrong answers. In the control group with no Confederates, participants only got it wrong about 1% of the time. This was a trivial task with no real difficulty. But in the groups with Confederates, participants gave a wrong answer 32% of the time, almost a third. They were influenced by the Confederates giving the wrong answer, and they conformed to these wrong answers going before them. Participants were influenced by the developing social norm. This was normative social influence at work. Again, this was a laboratory experiment. There was good control of the variables, and therefore a cause and effect relationship could be established. However, this was a trivial task with very little ecological validity, and again, participants were deceived by not being told that the other 7 people in their small group were actually Confederates. There are a number of situational factors which influence conformity. By situational factor, we mean a factor that varies with the situation. It's different in different environments, but it doesn't vary from person to person. The first of these factors was group size. Asch found that larger groups are more influential, and this makes people more likely to conform. But that only happens up to a certain point. After this point, group size has no effect. A second situational factor was social support, having others there who are supportive and are also prepared to dissent from the wider group. This makes it much more likely that any one individual will also not conform. And thirdly and finally, task difficulty. When the task is harder, people are much less likely to dissent. They feel less confident in their answers, and they look to others in the group for guidance. There were also dispositional factors which influence conformity. A dispositional factor is a factor which varies from individual person to individual person, but it remains the same in different environments. One of these was gender. Gender may be a factor in conformity, but research so far has not provided any strong conclusion either way. The traditional view, which has since been discredited, is that women were more likely to conform. A second dispositional factor is experience and expertise. Individuals with more experience or expertise in a given area are much less likely to conform to a group when doing a task in that area. They feel more confident in their own ability or knowledge, and they're therefore much less likely to conform, and they're much more likely to dissent from the wider group. A social role is a position within society. Some of these are roles we choose to take on, and they're voluntary, such as being a teacher, a waiter, or a volunteer for a charity. All of those are roles that we choose. But some roles are given to us without our consent. They're forced on us, such as being a sister, a son, a teenager, or even a prisoner. Each of these roles carries a given set of expected behaviours, social norms to which people are expected by wider society to conform. These norms obviously vary with different cultures and different time periods, and not everyone is always going to follow every social norm. Sometimes they will not conform to their social role. One thing that's notable is that one person can hold several of these social roles at one time. It's possible to be a son, a brother, a father, and a teacher all at once. The SPE, or Stanford Prison Experiment, was a landmark piece of research done in the early 1970s by a group of researchers led by Zimbardo. It was done to investigate conformity to social roles. A mock prison was set up, and a set of volunteers were randomly assigned one of two roles. They either became guards or they became prisoners. Conditions, especially for the prisoners, were very strict. The guards had a lot of power over the prisoners. The experience was made authentic to the prisoners with a mock arrest, a strip search, and forced transport to the prison. Both prisoners and guards conformed to their social roles. They exhibited extreme behaviour like rioting, violence, and aggression. Zimbardo concluded that the participants were conforming to their expected social roles. They were exhibiting the expected behaviour of prisoners and guards. The experiment was effectively under laboratory conditions, and therefore a cause and effect relationship could theoretically be established. Obviously, however, there were very severe ethical issues with this experiment. Both guards and prisoners suffered severe mental and physical health problems, and the SPE was called off and abandoned a few days early. As we've already seen, there were severe ethical issues with the SPE, and this meant that it was never precisely repeated or replicated. The danger to participants, both mentally and physically, was too great. However, other researchers have investigated how social roles affect our behaviour. Orlando in 1973 set up a mock psychiatric ward inside a real hospital. Hospital staff volunteered to become patients within this psychiatric ward. Within a short amount of time, a couple of days, they began to behave like real patients in a real psychiatric ward, despite knowing that they were not real patients and not in a real ward. They became despondent, depressed, and felt that they had lost their sense of identity. Orlando concluded that they were conforming to the expected behaviour of prisoners in this type of institution. The study was also useful in helping to explain the behaviour of real patients in real wards, and also helping, therefore, to improve their treatment and conditions. Following the genocide of the Holocaust in World War II, psychologists have been trying through the 20th century to explain how so many people could have obeyed and complied with the genocide of the Nazi regime. One of these investigations was filmed in 2006 for BBC television, and in many ways it was similar to the SPE. As with the SPE 3 decades earlier, volunteers were randomly assigned a status. They were either prisoners or they were guards, but critically they were told that one prisoner would become a guard after 3 days. However, unlike in the SPE, neither the prisoners or the guards conformed to the expected behaviour of their social roles. The prisoners very quickly formed a strong and united group, especially after the point where one of them was promoted. The guards never formed this strong or united group. They felt very uncomfortable with the power imbalance. The conclusion that was drawn was that social roles are flexible, and not everyone will always conform. Unlike with the SPE, there was some good ethical oversight of this experiment. There was an independent ethics committee to ensure that participants did not suffer mentally or physically. Because of this, and like the SPE, however, the experiment did have to be abandoned early for ethical reasons. In 1963, a landmark series of experiments regarding obedience was done by Stanley Milgram, a psychological researcher. Obedience can usually be defined as acting in response to a direct order. In this experiment, participants were volunteers responding to a flyer. They were told that they would be randomly assigned the role of either learner or teacher. In fact, they'd been deceived. They were always the teacher. These participants were instructed to deliver an electric shock to the learner every time the learner got a question wrong. This learner, however, was actually a Confederate. They were somebody working with the researcher and with full knowledge of how the experiment worked. The shocks were also fake, although the participants didn't know this. The labelled buttons on the machine ranged from 15 volts, which is a very slight shock, to 450 volts, marked danger, severe shock. Another Confederate, known as the experimenter and wearing a grey lab coat, would instruct the participant to continue if they hesitated or resisted. The participants genuinely thought, therefore, that they were delivering large, harmful, and painful electric shocks to innocent people. Incredibly, all of the participants in this research did deliver the shocks, up to at least 300 volts, and most went all the way up to 450. 300 volts was the point where the fake learner would bang on the wall in rage and pain. Milgram concluded that people will obey orders when they seem to be legitimate orders, even if it goes against their normal patterns of behaviour and thinking, or even against their conscience. Obviously, in this experiment, there were massive ethical issues. Participants showed stress and tension, and 4 even had nervous breakdowns. Participants were also deceived multiple times over the experiment. They were falsely told that their role was random, that the learner was real, and that the shocks were real. None of these were true. The study also had limited ecological validity. Delivering a series of painful and potentially lethal electric shocks to an innocent victim is a relatively unlikely scenario outside of a laboratory. The study also had limited internal validity. It's entirely possible and indeed probable that some participants suspected or realised that the shocks were not real. Milgram identified several situational factors which had an influence on how likely people were to obey. The first of these was proximity. When Milgram changed the experiment so that the participant and learner were in the same room, obedience dropped sharply. When the participant could clearly see the effect of their actions, they were less likely to obey. A second was allies. When an ally was present who refused to deliver the shock, participants were much less likely to obey. They too refused. A third situational factor was the proximity of authority. When Milgram removed the experimenter, and therefore the source of authority from the experience, obedience went down, and sharply. People were less likely to obey when there was no immediate source of authority in the experiment. And finally, location. The experiment had initially been done at the grand and prestigious Yale University. Milgram theorized that this location had raised obedience rates. When the experiment was repeated at a dank, dark inner-city office block, obedience fell. Following this research, Milgram put forward agency theory as an explanation for obedience. This theory holds that people obey orders because they are in an agentic state. An agentic state is when someone feels they are acting on behalf of a higher responsibility, which has issued the orders and will take responsibility for the actions. They therefore feel that they are an agent of this authority and not an autonomous and independent individual. Most people begin any task or experience in an independent state, behaving autonomously, but they move to an agentic state when they are given orders. This process is known as agentic shift. Milgram identified 3 binding factors, variables that kept an individual in this agentic state. The first was a reluctance to disrupt the experiment. The second was the pressure of a grand and trusted surrounding, like at Yale University. And the third was pressure from the authority figure. There is some experimental evidence to support agency theory, but there are also numerous other explanations of why people obey. Most people are taught from a young age that certain groups have legitimate forms of authority. They have a right to issue orders to us, and them issuing orders is correct. Examples include the police, our parents, teachers, and even the government. People are much more likely to obey orders from a source of authority that they regard as legitimate. And there are several ways that people decide if any given authority figure is legitimate. The first of these is legal process. Groups like the police and the government have legal backing to their authority. It falls within a defined social norm that most people accept. A second way is through knowledge or experience. Groups like doctors and teachers gain their legitimacy from their knowledge and experience. Most people trust the advice of and obey the orders of medical professionals because of their advanced knowledge. And lastly, there are social norms. Groups like scientists and senior business executives derive their authority from social norms: how they dress, how they speak, how they act. Milgram noticed in his research that people are much more likely to obey the experimenter when that experimenter is wearing a lab coat. Another explanation for obedience is the authoritarian personality. Following the end of World War II, there was a large amount of research done to try and establish why so many people had obeyed the wishes of the Nazi regime. One theory was that some people have an authoritarian personality. They will obey the orders of their superiors and issue orders to their inferiors. Adorno, who led a group of researchers in 1950, used a series of paired statements to place participants on an F scale, a measurement of their authoritarian personalities. F stood for fascism, and much of this research was aimed at understanding and preventing fascism. This theory held that some people, usually due to overly strict parenting, had been unable to challenge their parents or any authority, which had led to feelings of constraint and restriction. They therefore directed aggression resulting from that towards people they regarded as being inferior or lesser, while they unquestioningly obeyed those they thought of as being superior. There was some research evidence to back this theory, but the study done in 1950 was mired in bias of a personal, political, and methodological nature. Everyone is vulnerable to the influence of wider society and social groups at least some of the time and in some situations. Psychologists have identified the factors which tend to make us more resistant to social influence and make us more likely to act independently or autonomously. The first of these is social support. Having someone present with you in the group who agrees with you and is prepared to support you when you dissent from that group makes it much more likely that you will dissent from the wider norms and consensus of that wider social society. The second is aspects of personality. Research done by Rociher in 1966 found that people who have an internal locus of control are more likely to be able to resist social influence. People with an internal locus of control believe that they alone are in control of their life. People with an external locus of control believe that their life is down to luck and external factors. In 1969, a researcher called Moscovici investigated how a minority can influence a much larger majority. 192 women who were the participants were asked to name the colours of 36 slides. All of these slides were actually blue. In the control group, participants only got this wrong 0.25% of the time, effectively none. But in actual groups, a minority of 2 Confederates, people working with the researcher, gave a deliberately wrong answer. They called some or all of the slides green. When this happened, many of the participants also said the slides were green. They had been influenced by the minority. This experiment was under controlled laboratory conditions, but it had little ecological validity. The colour coding of slides is an unlikely task in the real world. This was also a trivial task as shown by the control group, and there were no consequences. Participants had nothing to lose by changing their answer or getting the answer wrong. There was also an ethical issue. Participants were deceived into thinking their entire group of 6 was made up of participants. There were actually 2 Confederates present. Moscovici put forward conversion theory, which said that members of the majority are converted to the minority view, and this was his explanation for minority influence. Moscovici, along with many other researchers, identified several factors which change how likely a minority is to influence a majority. The first of these was consistency. When a minority is consistent and unchanging, it becomes more likely that members of the majority will be swayed or persuaded. The second is flexibility. When a minority is flexible and willing to compromise or alter their approach, it becomes much more likely that they will change the mind of at least some of the majority. In 1981, social impact theory was put forward. This also outlined 3 factors which change the extent of minority influence. The first is strength. A stronger, more vocal and more powerful minority is much more likely to influence the majority. The second is numbers. A numerically larger minority is much more influential than a numerically smaller minority. And the third is immediacy. If a minority is close to a majority in terms of physical distance or personal relationships, then the influence of that minority increases. Social impact theory says that once these 3 factors reach a certain threshold, the majority would begin to sway to the minority. When people in a group agree with the minority, then the minority starts to exert influence. As this happens, more and more members of the majority will start to agree with the minority and convert towards their viewpoint. This is called the snowball effect. And eventually the minority becomes the majority, and the old majority becomes the new minority. They switch places. At this point, the minority has successfully exerted influence to such an extent that it has become dominant. There are two key examples of this which are useful for exams. The first is civil rights in the US. The idea of racial equality was a minority view until about the 1960s. The actions of a vocal, strong minority gradually changed this view until racial equality became a widely accepted majority. A second example is the rights of LGBT people in the UK. For most people before the 1970s, the very idea of homosexuality was repulsive and repugnant to them. This was a very strong majority view that was gradually changed by the actions of an immediate, numerate, vocal minority.